It looked like nothing more than a simple studio portrait of a mother and her daughters, but if you look closer, your eyes are drawn to their hands. Dr. James Mitchell had spent nearly 15 years studying old photographic archives at the New York Historical Society, yet he had never come across anything quite like this. The image came from a donation box sent after an estate sale in Brooklyn. Inside were dozens of glass plate negatives, each carefully wrapped in brittle newspaper dated 1923. Most of the images were familiar scenes from the late 1800s, stiff merchants with serious faces, wedding groups standing awkwardly still, children dressed neatly in their Sunday clothing. Then one photograph made him stop breathing for a moment. 3 women stared back at him across more than a century. A mother, likely around 40, sat in the center on an ornate wooden chair. On each side stood her daughters, who appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s. All 3 were African American, dressed in their best clothing, rich-colored dresses with fine lace details, their hair carefully styled. Behind them was a painted garden backdrop, the kind commonly used in studios of that era. What caught James's attention was not their proud expressions or careful posing, it was their hands. The mother's hands rested calmly in her lap, but her fingers were arranged in a strange pattern. Her right thumb crossed over the left, while her index and middle fingers were extended and the rest curled inward. Each daughter placed one hand on their mother's shoulders, and their fingers were shaped in similar, deliberate ways. James had studied thousands of Victorian-era photographs. People usually held their hands naturally, folded loosely or resting on furniture. Photographers demanded total stillness because exposure times were long. Every pose mattered. These hand positions felt far too precise to be accidental. He picked up a magnifying glass and leaned closer to the negative. In the lower right corner, barely noticeable, tiny numbers had been scratched into the glass. NY 892,247. Music. James could not get the image out of his mind. That night, back in his Upper West Side apartment, he spread his research notes across the dining table. He had already taken high-resolution photographs of the negative, and now the portrait filled his laptop screen in sharp detail. For an image from 1892, the clarity was astonishing. He could see the weave of the fabric, the small brooch pinned at the mother's collar, even subtle differences in the daughters' faces. Still, his eyes returned again and again to the hands. He zoomed in until each finger filled the screen. There was no doubt now, this was not random. The mother's crossed thumb required effort to hold during a long exposure. Her fingers formed a clear shape. The daughter's hands echoed that shape with slight variations, each finger bent at careful angles, each thumb placed with intent. James had studied Civil War images, Reconstruction-era records, and early social reform photography. He knew that activists and underground groups often used visual signals, coded poses, or symbolic objects. Even a stance or gesture could carry meaning for those trained to see it. He opened his database on abolitionist and post-emancipation networks. The Underground Railroad had used quilts, songs, and symbols, but this photograph dated to 1892, nearly 30 years after emancipation and 15 years after Reconstruction ended. Who still needed secret signals? His phone vibrated. It was his colleague, Dr. Sarah Chen, an expert in African American history, replying to his earlier message. "Free tomorrow morning. What did you find?" James typed back quickly. "Something that could change what we know about post-Reconstruction activism in New York. Bring anything you have on property rights and documentation struggles." Sarah arrived at the Historical Society at exactly 9, carrying a worn leather bag full of papers. James had projected the portrait onto the research room wall, large and commanding. The 3 women looked down at them with quiet strength. "Look at their hands," James said, pointing with a laser, each finger clearly intentional. Sarah stepped closer, her expression tightening with focus. She placed her bag down and opened a thick folder. After Reconstruction collapsed in 1877, she explained, African American families in the North faced a different fight. Not slavery, but systematic exclusion. Property ownership inheritance, Even proving identity became tools used against them. She spread out documents, legal filings, city records, newspaper clippings from the 1880s and 1890s. New York was not the safe haven many imagined. Black families struggled to keep property, open businesses, and prove legal marriages. Many had escaped the South with nothing but their names, no birth records, no marriage licenses, no official proof. James picked up an old newspaper dated 1891. The headline read, "Property Dispute in Harlem. Family claims ownership without documentation." "Exactly," Sarah said. She explained that she had been studying mutual aid societies from this era. African American communities built networks to help one another survive these systems. They shared money to hire lawyers, exchanged information about fair officials, and created their own methods of verification when official ones shut them out. "Secret networks," James said quietly. "Not secret like hidden," Sarah corrected. "Secret like parallel." They worked beside official systems, using methods white authorities either ignored or didn't understand. James looked back at the portrait. "What if this isn't just a family photo?" he asked. "What if it's proof?" The etched number in the corner, NY 890 2247, turned out to be the key. After 2 days digging through city directories and business listings, James found a match. Studio 247 belonged to a photographer named Thomas Wright, operating on 8th Avenue from 1888 to 1896. The building still stood, now converted into apartments. James stood on the sidewalk, imagining the past. Wright's studio would have been on the second floor, with large north-facing windows for soft, even light. Research into Wright revealed something unusual. He was white, born in Massachusetts in 1851, trained in Boston, and moved to New York in 1887. His studio sat in a growing, diverse neighborhood of Irish and Italian immigrants and a rising African-American population moving north. Unlike most white photographers, who either refused black clients or charged them more, Wright advertised in African-American newspapers and offered equal prices to everyone. Sarah found an interview Wright gave to a small progressive paper in 1894. He spoke about photography as a way to preserve dignity and identity, saying every person deserved a quality portrait. Reading between the lines, James sensed quiet resistance, a deliberate choice to serve a community others pushed aside. He was an ally, Sarah said, and if these hand gestures are codes, he likely helped design and record them. James reached out to Dr. Marcus Thompson, a cryptography historian at Columbia who specialized in visual codes. Marcus arrived that afternoon, intrigued by James's vague call. "Victorian codes often seem impossibly complex today," Marcus explained as he studied the image, "but they were usually practical for the people who used them. The key was context, who needed to communicate, what they needed to say, and who they needed to hide it from." He photographed the hands from multiple angles and began tracing them digitally. "Let's assume each hand position means something specific," he said. "Not letters. That would be too complicated for a photograph. More likely categories, confirmations, or status markers." Sarah nodded and pulled out her notes. "What if it's identity verification?" she asked. "These communities needed ways to confirm who someone was, that they belonged, that they could be trusted." Marcus looked up slowly and nodded in agreement. "Yes. So the mother's hand position may have shown her role, the head of the family, a trusted network member, someone confirming others. The daughter's hand shapes may have shown their status, documented, undocumented, or asking for help." They spent the rest of the afternoon comparing this portrait with other photographs James had found in the same estate sale box. 3 more images showed similar hand arrangements, always subtle and always intentional. In one image, a couple's fingers were linked in a careful pattern. In another, a man rested his hand on a Bible with certain finge. "RS extended in a very specific way. This isn't a single code," Marcus said at last. "It's a system, multiple signals that could be combined to share different meanings. Someone taught these families how to pose. Someone photographed them on purpose, and others in the network knew how to read what they were seeing." Sarah then made the connection that changed everything. While studying property rights cases in New York courts from the 1890s, she noticed a pattern. Dozens of African American families had successfully defended land claims, secured identity papers, or proved legal marriages. Again and again, the same lawyer appeared in the records. His name was Robert Hayes. Hayes had an office on West 34th Street. Court documents showed he won an unusually high number of cases for black clients at a time when such outcomes were rare. More importantly, he often submitted photographic evidence, family portraits that showed respectability and presence in the community. James suddenly understood. Hayes was using Wright's photographs in court, not only to show identity, but to confirm community standing. These families had been photographed and cataloged. When they needed proof, Hayes could present their portraits to judges. But there was more. In Hayes's archived files at the New York Public Library, Sarah found letters. They were exchanges between Hayes and other activists, teachers, ministers, and business owners discussing verification methods in community documentation. Stems. One letter from March 1893 stood out. Hayes wrote to a Brooklyn minister, "We have expanded our photographic documentation to include 73 families." Mr. Wright continues his services at very little cost. The hand positioning system allows us to encode key information that can be verified later. Each portrait serves as both dignified image and practical identification. James leaned back, overwhelmed. They had built a complete, parallel documentation system. When official systems failed these families, they created their own and hid it in plain sight. These photographs looked like ordinary family portraits. To a casual viewer, nothing seemed strange. But to those who knew the code, each image carried crucial information. Once the network began to take shape, James became determined to identify the 3 women in the original portrait. The estate sale had come from a brownstone in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, an area with a deep African American history. Donor records listed the seller as Patricia Johnson, who had inherited the house from her grandmother. James called her that evening. She was 72, sharp-spoken, and doubtful at first about his interest in old photos. But when he described the portrait, her voice softened. "That's my great-grandmother," she said quietly. "Her name was Eleanor Morrison. The daughters would be my grandmother Ruth and her sister Grace." James asked if she could tell him more. Patricia paused. Eleanor had been born enslaved in 5th Virginia. She came north after the war with Ruth, who was still a baby. Grace was born in New York. Eleanor worked as a seamstress, known for her lace and fine embroidery, and supported the family that way. When James asked if Eleanor had belonged to any groups or organizations, Patricia said she was active in her church and helped people. That was what her grandmother always said. Eleanor helped families with paperwork, housing, and finding lawyers. She knew how to work every system. James felt his heart race. He told Patricia he believed her great-grandmother had been part of an important network that helped African American families protect their rights after Reconstruction. Patricia was silent again. When she spoke, her voice was emotional. She said she always knew Eleanor was special, but so much history had been lost. After Eleanor died in 1919, the family scattered and her grandmother rarely spoke about those early years. With Patricia's permission, James and Sarah began tracing Eleanor Morrison's connections. Church records from Bethel Church in Brooklyn listed Eleanor as a member from 1879 until her death. She served on the Ladies' Aid Society, which officially provided charity, but the meeting notes showed more structure. They kept detailed records of families helped, including names, ages, and needs. Some entries contained strange numbers and letter codes that made no sense until Sarah realized they matched Thomas Wright's numbering system. They were cross-referencing. The church identified families needing documentation. Wright photographed them using the correct hand codes. Hayes used the photos in court, and church records quietly tracked everything under the cover of charity work. James found more images in Wright's archive. The Historical Society had acquired his entire collection in 1923, but it had never been fully studied. Dozens of portraits showed the same hand code system. Families photographed between 1890 and 1896, each image carefully numbered, each one recording people excluded from official records. They identified more members of the network. A teacher named Samuel Brooks helped children obtain school records. A clerk in the property office named Mary Chen processed deeds and ensured paperwork went through. A minister, Reverend James Washington, performed marriages and issued certificates when officials refused. Each person took quiet risks, using their position to help others within a system designed to shut them out. Together, they created something powerful, a shadow archive that preserved dignity and protection when official America did not. 3 months later, James and Sarah organized an exhibition at the Historical Society. They displayed 20 of Wright's portraits, each showing coded hand positions and the story behind the family. Patricia Johnson attended with her daughter and granddaughter. 4 generations of Eleanor Morrison's family stood before the image that started it all, the Mo. St. Moving moment came when other descendants arrived. James and Sarah had located families linked to 12 of the portraits. Each brought pieces of history, stories, letters, and documents that now made sense. An elderly man named Thomas Hayes stood before a portrait of his great-grandfather, Robert Hayes, shown with the same hand code. He said he always knew his ancestor helped people but never realized how organized it was. A woman named Grace Brooks looked at a portrait of Samuel Brooks. Her family said he was arrested in 1895 for helping a family get false papers, but charges were dropped. Seeing the image now, she believed the documents were not false at all. He was helping people get the papers they deserved but were denied. The New York Times covered the exhibition with the headline, "Hidden in Plain Sight: How Post-Reconstruction Activists Built a Secret Documentation Network." Within days, historians across the country reached out, sharing similar discoveries in Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago. Parallel networks had existed everywhere, using subtle codes and photography to protect families facing hostile systems. 6 months after first finding the portrait, James stood in the conservation lab, carefully holding the glass plate negative. Dozens of Wright's images had been digitally restored and made available to families and researchers. The mother and daughter's portrait became iconic, appearing in books, documentaries, and museums. But for James, it stayed deeply personal. He thought of Eleanor Morrison, born enslaved, who built a life of purpose in New York, who helped countless families, and who posed with her daughters in 1892, their hands arranged in a code meant to protect their future. Patricia later donated Eleanor's papers to the society, including letters, a diary, and business records. In the diary, Eleanor wrote about the photo. She said they had their portrait taken that day. Mr. Wright was kind and understood what they were building. The girls were nervous, but she told them the picture would matter. One day people would see what they had done. She was right. The photograph mattered. It preserved not only their faces, but proof of their resistance, creativity, and refusal to disappear. Sarah traced 63 families through the network, showing how they gained deeds, marriages, licenses, and school records, rights that should have been automatic but required complex effort. The network worked from about 1888 to 1897, helping hundreds before slowly fading as people moved on or passed away. Thomas Wright died in 1923, mostly forgotten. Robert Hayes practiced law until 1910. Eleanor Morrison lived to see her daughter settled, her work continued by others. The network did not fix injustice, but it gave real help to people who needed it. James now met often with descendants, recording stories and reconnecting families linked by this hidden history. The portrait became more than evidence. It became a bridge across generations, proof that their ancestors were smart, united, and determined to create justice when the nation failed them. He thought again of Eleanor's hands in that Brooklyn studio, fingers forming a code that would outlive her and carry her story forward. In the end, the smallest gestures can hold the deepest truths. Sometimes you only need to look closely enough to see them.